Hello and welcome to Pullback. On our normal series, we discuss solutions to big problems with experts in their field. But we're on vacation right now, and Kristen and I recorded an episode about the book Chain Gang All-Stars. We recorded this originally for our Patreon members, but we liked the book so much that we decided to share it to our general feed. So this is a looser sort of style of discussion, and we'll be releasing something special for our Patreons probably next week. But for now, please enjoy this book club of Chain Gang All-Stars. Listeners, welcome. Hi, everyone. How are you? Good? That's good. Today, Kristen and I read a book. It's funny because the last book we did was
different.
Yeah. What's the word I'm looking for? It was like a fairy tale that was like almost for children, but not quite. This is a fairy tale that is very much for adults, and it is dark. We're doing Chain Gang All-Stars, which I've been on a hold for at the library since February 16th. I've been waiting for the audiobook, but then last week you were like, let's read this book for the Patreon. So I got the book, and I'm still on hold for the audiobook. And I'm really excited to listen to it now. I'm very, very excited because the book was so good. Kristen, tell everyone what it's about.
Yeah, it's basically a story about what if the U.S. prison system took the idea of gladiators and made it into like a commercial sport industry.
Yeah, it's a very well done vision of that future. Like at first, the premise, you're like, okay, like this is pretty fun, but it's going to be kind of like, I was thinking more like Hunger Games, like a little bit more unbelievable. But the author, Kwame, Adjei-Brenyah, they're like a new author.
Yeah, it's a debut novel and like so impressively done for a debut novel.
I think it's one of the best books I've ever read. I think I can say that. I was thinking that like halfway through the book, I was like, is this the best book I've ever read? Like that thought came to me a few times. It's up there.
Yeah, it's really good. And I think it's one of those books where, I mean, if you just say the premise the way that like I did, it has a high potential to be sort of a very like one-dimensional, hits you over the head, not subtle enough kind of book. And I was worried that it was going to be that way, but it wasn't at all. There was so many dimensions. Like it made a lot of points, and it did so not always subtly, but it did so with like fully fleshed out characters. You were really into the plot the whole time. Like just really well done as a novel. And also like some of the points that the book made were like more intricate and interesting than I was expecting. As somebody who is like inherently morally disgusted by the idea, as most of us would be.
I also really liked the use of footnotes. I think a lot of what made this so good, because like for the first like 2 or 3 chapters, I was like, okay, this is going to be a fun story. It's like an indictment on the U.S. penal system, which, you know, is never out of fashion, but it's going to ultimately be a little bit more fantastical, I figured. But the footnotes are all statistics from the real world, and that he uses it to tie into the story a way to kind of make it really believable that the vision of the penal system that he has written out could very much come to pass. Like it did not feel like a fantasy to me. It felt like a vision of like 30 years from now or less, honestly.
Yeah, it felt like disturbingly inevitable.
Yeah.
Which is never comfortable.
Yeah. I read a little bit of like the acknowledgments and the people who helped him write it. And it sounds like it took him several years to write it, which makes sense. But again, like this topic is evergreen, sadly. And he worked with quite a few activist groups, including like trans rights groups and like just people who are in the system a little bit more like hands-on, boots on the ground. And you can tell that he talked to the right people while writing this book. I've read a lot of sci-fi where I'm like, ooh, this is a vision. This is like a dark mirror being held up to society. But this was a lot. I don't know, Kristen, maybe you can get to the heart of what I'm trying to say. The wordsmith.
No, I mean, I think you're right. I think it might be helpful for us to go through like some broad strokes of the plot so that people have a sense of what happens.
Yes, and I'm going to say actually up at the front here, I don't want to spoil the ending because like the closer I got to the end, the more I was like, I have to know what happens next. And I don't want to spoil the very end, but I think we might spoil a few of the, like some of the like plot points, but not the big ending. I think you know what I mean.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It was interesting because it started as a book that wasn't all that plot driven for me, but like by the end, I was very gripped.
Yeah, I was very invested in the outcome. But the story follows, I'd say there's four main characters and then quite a few side characters. The author, what he's written before this was like a group of short stories. And so you can tell that's kind of what he's used to doing. And so the chapters kind of jump between character views, including some minor characters like the announcer at the blood sports game gets a chapter where you can kind of see what his view is, and he kind of has a little arc that I think is really lovely. So I think ultimately the story is about like how people can change, and it's not inevitable that you're always going to be the same person. And I don't know, I really liked that theme. But the four main characters we start with are Loretta Thurwar.
Sorry, before you go into I just wanted to add something to what you're saying, because I thought it was great.
Yeah, please.
Because I think there's like two sides to that coin, right? Like part of the story is about like how everybody has the capacity for change. Whereas I think it's Stax, who we're about to introduce, says it's like everybody is like diamonds covered in crap, but is everybody also just crap that's like made to look like diamonds? So the flip side is like it is incredibly easy for people to sort of slide into these like disgusting moral acts. So I think it's important that the story covers some of the spectators as well, including somebody who goes in with like a sense of moral disgust and becomes like gripped by what is like an inherently very gripping sport, but it's also like a tapestry of human misery at the same time.
Yeah, no, and I really like the journeys that all of the characters go on, and I also really appreciate the way that the book doesn't exactly tell you the answers, right? Like a lot of the main characters really struggle with their own identity and question, like, am I a good person? Can I be redeemed? A lot of the people who participate in the blood sports, like the people who sign up to be the gladiators, they hate themselves. Like a lot of them sign up because they want to die. Like it's not necessarily because so the premise is this is how the blood sports work. If you have been sentenced to more than 25 years in prison, then you have the option of signing up for these gladiator sports. And if you survive the games for 3 years, you get your freedom. And it's been going on for about 11 years because they do 3 seasons a year, and they're entering like season 33 now. So it's been just over a decade. And only one person has ever escaped the games, just to make it look like you can. But that person was like a plant, like they were kind of fed through the system. So a lot of people go in kind of knowing that they're not going to make it out. But there's also that hope that you will. And so there's this like really interesting dynamic where many of the characters, there's one character who is just about to get, like there's a couple of characters who just before they're about to be freed actually choose to die instead because they don't know what their life on the outside is going to be like, which I think is very reminiscent of how a lot of people who spend a lot of time in prison feel in our world today, let alone without having gone through a blood sport thing where you have to kill like 24 people to get out.
Yeah. And like, I mean, I know we will get to the plot eventually, but like one of the things I really appreciate about the way this was set up, you could just tell how much thought had gone into what this would look like in a real society. Because every element is like, they've thought through the economics of how this program would work and how it would be marketed to be palatable to people. The author thought through like, oh yeah, of course there would be protest. Here's what it would look like. Here's how it would interact with the business people. Here's how like you would have people join the program, what like legal requirements there would be. And also like what might drive people sort of in regular prisons to go there. And you see like snapshots of the horror that they're going through that drives them into this like nightmare scape. I thought that attention to detail was so interesting, and it really like it fed into this sense of like we are only a few bad decisions away from this being real.
Yeah, for real. Yeah, and like there was a couple of two of the main characters, Simon Kraft and I just read it yesterday. Simon Kraft and who was the second guy?
Was this the singer guy? Yeah.
Yeah, the singer. They both kind of come from experimental facilities, and they have a really interesting vision of, I don't think what the prison system is like now, but again, not far off from where it could be very easily. So one of them comes from a prison where you have to be completely silent, and he hasn't spoken in years. Like I think it's like a decade or something wild. It might even be, I don't know, maybe it's only 2 years. I don't remember the details, but it's long enough that he starts to crack a bit. And the way they enforce this no speaking policy is when you become a prisoner, they insert like magnets into your wrists that not only keep you like they act as like handcuffs when you are needed, but they give you like a zap if you like there's a silent mode. So if you speak in silent mode, they like give you a horrible zap with bad pain. So this guy, singer, he ends up getting into the blood sports, and he sings a lot. He sings to himself. As soon as he's allowed to start using his voice, he just doesn't stop. And I loved his character. I really thought he was an interesting look at like what happens when you just kind of fuck with people and you're not sure what the results are going to be. He also comes from a meatpacking plant. So his view of the blood sports is very interesting. He's like, I'm slicing meat, no matter where I am. And it's, yeah. And then his partner, Simon J. Kraft, he comes from solitary confinement, and he was in solitary for a really long time. And then he was tortured by police with these incentivizers, this really horrific device that like has been scientifically developed to like give you the most pain that a human can endure without killing you. And it drives him like completely out of himself. He dissociates completely. His entire personality like kind of vanishes, and his nervous system gets all messed up. So he's got a permanent smile on his face, and
he basically becomes the Joker.
Yeah. You get a chapter from the perspective of the woman who was behind the development of that device, and that's so fascinating too, because it's really far away from what she was working on, and it just shows how like the system can really corrupt your intentions in a way that you can't control. And I found that like whole aspect of it very fascinating as well. So those are the two minor main characters. Any thoughts on those two?
Well, no, I wanted to go to the lady that created the influencers, because I thought that she was a really interesting character, even though she doesn't appear that often in the book. But there are a couple of characters like her in this novel that their main role is to sort of like they get swept along with this evil system, but then at a certain point they make a decision that like reasserts justice for themselves, and they like bear the consequences of that. And they don't really win, but like you don't see them reaping rewards from it. Like she ends up going to prison. The other person I'm thinking of is like the announcer that finally gets her big break and like basically says, fuck this sport, it's evil, and then gets fired. But I think it's a good reminder of like the agency that everybody still has in a dystopian system, which is an important reminder because you also have all these characters that are just kind of swept along for the ride. So it's like, even though most of them are going and you're sort of emoting with them as like, there's a woman who's like married to a guy that loves blood sports.
I believe her name is Emily.
Emily, thank you. I don't know the names of anybody.
I just read it yesterday.
But like she kind of gets swept along, and I think like you're as the reader meant to kind of associate with her, right? Because you start from a point of moral disgust and then you kind of become gripped by these characters. And so in the end, she just becomes a fan of the blood sport, and it's kind of easy to relate to her and say, well, it's a dystopian system. It's not really her fault. This is just the society that she's in. But there are these other characters that make these kind of radical choices, which I think really just kind of emphasizes that it's not okay for us to just sort of follow the current and to be swept along with like the dystopia that we live in. We do have chances to act, and it's not cost-free, but it's right.
But it's also like not inevitable that we end up in a world like this. And even if it does come to pass, I think what was really interesting about this was that all of these characters who were protesting it, or like even in the end, you get like a board meeting with all of the people who like run this sport, and like 3 people kind of stand up to, there was a decision being made that was really messed up. And 3 people in that room kind of stood up to say something, but they were really meek about it. And it's this balance of like, well, I need to keep my job, but also I'm kind of doing the wrong thing. I think one of my favorite characters was Mickey. I think his name's Mickey Wright, the announcer who is like on the field with the gladiators when they're killing each other. And his journey was really fascinating to me because he does speak up for the two main characters, the women that we're going to discuss in the meeting. It's pretty weak, and he does have a bit of a moment near the end where he does, like, he becomes kind of a conscientious objector, but he doesn't do it in the same way that the female announcer did when she became like the Sportsnet newscaster. When she, like, her first day on the job, she stands up and she's like, I oppose this. He kind of opposes it in his own small way, and it's kind of implied at the end that perhaps he's lost his job because of that. And it's like, well, if you're going to lose your job anyways, like, go hard, right? Go hard or go home. And I thought it was just a really interesting example of how people can justify their own moral issues. Like, but he starts out, he gets a chapter at the beginning where he's like, you can tell he's really into it. He really believes in what he's doing. And then he gets a chapter at the end where it's like, he's kind of come around to the idea that, like, maybe I'm participating and I'm like the face of this shit in like some nasty stuff that's like not okay. So I really liked his character, and I think he was my favorite minor character.
Yeah, there were just so many interesting facets, but we should talk about the two characters you introduced that I then wildly swung us off course for. So,
yes. No, that's okay. It's such a good book, and everybody should read it and then listen to our episode. So, like, it's fine. I cannot recommend a book more. It's so much fun. It was so much fun to read. It was really gripping and compelling the whole way through. But I'm into that sort of stuff. Like, I was a Hunger Games kid. I read I like the idea of, like, what would it take for people to just, like, kill each other for sport? And this book is the closest I've ever come to seeing, like, whoa, like, actually, this could happen next year. Like, if Trump becomes president, for real. Like,
yeah, troublingly so.
But the main characters, Loretta Thurwar, she's the one who opens the book. She quickly becomes the most badass gladiator in the system, and you get to see her first battle. That's how the book opens, which, like, mwah, very, very lovely way to start a book. And then you kind of pick up with her near the end of her term. So you don't follow her through the first 2.5 years. You're picking up with her when she's just a couple of weeks away from actually gaining her freedom. And you mostly get to see, like, her reflections on how she's gotten to where she is, how she's changed over the time that she has. But there's also certain chapters that take place in the past where you actually get, like, her point of view from, like, the moments that she was experiencing. So, like, the book jumped through time in a way that I found very compelling.
Yeah. I've never read a book where the flashbacks were more well done. This author clearly thought about what is the best way to convey, like, each piece of information and when do you most want to hear it. God, I was impressed by the craftsmanship of this book. So good.
Yes, it was so well crafted, considering how short the chapters were and how often they bounced between characters and timelines. I never felt lost. I did find that at the beginning of every chapter, the first paragraph was always a little bit like, okay, who is this and when is this? But it's always explained very quickly. It's almost like a nice feeling, like he lets you drift a little bit and then he catches you up right away. And you're like, oh, there we are. I'm tethered again. And it was just a really I think it was a really interesting way to make the reader feel as though their feet, like, you couldn't quite get your feet under you. And that's why I'm really excited to listen to it again.
Yeah. And I will say also, like, I listened to it as an audiobook, and I found that was, like, a really compelling way to do it because they had, like, different voice actors. So, like, I didn't have that sense of confusion most of the time just because you could immediately hear, like, oh, this is from, like, this person's voice. Although sometimes I was like, okay, who's the guy that sings again?
Yeah, Singer and Smiles, I did have trouble distinguishing for the first couple of chapters because both of their situations were so similar in that they were very depressing and they didn't have much personality because one of them had the personality stripped away from him by being silent and one had the personality stripped away by being in isolation. And so neither of them had characters, I would say. They were both very much an example of what the penal system can do to people if you just if you're tortured enough, really, like,
Yeah, but they were also, I think, playing the position of, like, the WWE bad guys, you know? Like, they didn't have developed story. I mean, they did have storylines to some extent, but you were mostly just meant to see them as, like, well, these guys are cracked. Although I was pro Singer, he was interesting.
I thought they were very interesting characters, and so the whole point of these four, Loretta Thurwar and Stax, Hamera Stacker, the Hurricane Stax, is the other main character. Stax is fantastic. I'm so excited to hear her voice actor for the audiobook, but she was probably my favorite character in the book. She's really interesting because she was put in prison for murder, but she was murdering her rapist. And so the reasons that a lot of these people are in prison is a commentary on the system itself, in a way where every time somebody dies, there is a footnote explaining what they were doing in prison for the most part, or maybe what their final thoughts were, or something to just kind of finalize that character and round them out. And so it was really interesting because there's some characters where you really they're really likable. And in the end, they die and you're like, oh, that's sad. And then you find out why they were in prison and you're like, whoa, like that's really dark. And it kind of makes you question this whole, the morality of, the prison system and the idea that people cannot be reformed.
Yeah. And I think that like the mix of people is pretty realistic in a lot of different senses. Like there's a fair amount of like diversity in a way that does reflect the prison population. There is also like a good mix of people who are like just really bad dudes that like were rapists versus like people like there's I think one person who was innocent, and then Stax, of course, like I think most of us would consider her crime to be morally justified. Like there's just a really good sort of like variety of characters that give you a realistic sense of what it would look like, but it's not done in a way that kind of hits you over the head. And like really important to telling the story. Like, of course, if you have blood sports that reflect the prison, you're going to have there was one like Nazi gang that was just out there like killing every like new like non-white entrant that joined their chain. Oh, we should explain chains.
All right, so the premise of this story is you become a gladiator. You've signed the paperwork. You're legally binded. And the idea is that you become an executioner of the state. Because a lot of these people are on death row anyways. So you're just carrying out the executions. And part of it is they make it really sportsmanlike. Like you have a team, which is called a chain, and that's your chain gang. And chain members cannot fight each other, although they do often kill each other out of the arena. So a big part of, the killing only happens like every 2 weeks. That's like only a part of the sport that you're viewing. A lot of the other time, there's like cameras that are like live feeding what the chains are up to when they're just like in camp. So they get put out into the wilderness to survive together. Although in later seasons, the surviving is like, it's more like late season Survivor where like everything's kind of set up for you. and they don't want their gladiators dying from snake bites or, hypothermia. But they do want people to have a chance to watch these people interact with each other. So there's like a whole bunch of time where the audience can just watch them strategize and talk with each other and just kind of live their lives. And honestly, I can't say I wouldn't watch, right? Like it sounds like that's what ends up getting Emily, the newcomer, into the show in the first place, because it's not as violent. There is some violence, but our main characters, Loretta and Stax, they are on a chain that has been pretty stable for a while, and they introduce a rule for their chain where it's like, we're not going to kill each other. It's hard enough to survive the arena without worrying about a knife in your back as well, right? So I don't know. I was like, damn, like a reality TV show to go along with it. That is good marketing.
No, it's really interesting. And then maybe we should explain blood points as well.
You get a certain number of points when you kill somebody, and then you can use those points as money. So you can get yourself a bigger and better tent. So like when you're a rookie or a peanut, when you first start out in the arena, you don't have anything. So you just sleep like in a sleeping bag outside under the stars. But as you kill more people, you can upgrade your weapons, you can upgrade your sleeping quarters, you can upgrade your meals, and which makes you a better fighter. So the more you kill, the more you can kill, really.
And I think you also can get blood points through sponsorships with companies, which is a big part of how Stax, I think, rises. Her model of gladiator is she's more like an influencer almost. Like she's all peace and love and like make sure that she's sort of like has compelling messages and is always upbeat. Whereas like a lot of the other people are like, fuck you, fuck the system.
Yeah, but a lot of them do play towards sponsorship, right? Like, but she does it really well. Like, there's a very little scene where, you know, she goes to hug a pillow and she's like, oh, it's just so comfy. And it's like, yeah, she's trying to get sponsored by that company that like that pillow company is going to get a bunch of sales because Stax, like the Hurricane Stax, hugged their pillow. And so now they're going to be like, oh, do you want a free one? So that's how you can get upgrades too, is like the companies will send you free stuff. And it's fascinating because you get like a chapter, a very short chapter from the perspective of like the marketing manager for the blood sports and how he is like, okay, we need people to sponsor this stuff. How do we make it palatable? And he's a very good marketer.
Yeah, I think that's what makes this book so interesting is just how capitalism is woven so deeply into the entire story, which like I think is the key thing. There are a couple of things that make it different from Hunger Games, but that's like one of the key differences is instead of it being kind of like a vaguely anti-state book, this one is really like, what if like carceral capitalism did even more carceral capitalism?
yeah. What if we did not even that much more?
Not even that much more. One of the things that I also found really interesting about this book, and maybe we can introduce the character of Sunshine and his daughter in a bit, but meditations like internally with the characters about sort of like their own guilt and like whether they're a good person or not, but also like the people whose lives they touch and how sort of they're reflecting on things too. You have one character, again, can't remember the name, but the daughter of Sunshine.
Marissa.
Marissa, thank you. Her feelings about her dad are very complicated, but she ends up becoming this like, basically like an abolitionist protester who's protesting blood sports quite specifically. And I think it adds a lot of texture to like discussions about prison abolition, like, because you hear the arguments that we would have heard like a lot during the George Floyd protests and like that we continue to hear, but like don't get magnified as much anymore about like how, you know, prison abolition isn't necessarily about taking away security. It's about like adding all these positive supports and things like that. But you also get it from like a really interesting narrator in that case. So it doesn't feel like it's being shoved down your throat because it's coming from her like sense of conflict around her dad and what like how society failed her dad and failed her. But you also like she gets in a fight with a journalist at some point who's like sort of spouting the like thin blue line kind of approach.
Yeah, and it's interesting because that journalist comes in from the perspective of her sister having been killed by violent crime. And it's like, in this future that the author imagines so clearly, violent crime has only risen because, of course it has. The private prison system, it doesn't exist to make crime go away, and it has not deterred crime. Like, the United States is one of the most they have the most crime, they have the most people in prison, like globally. And of course, if you continue down that path and just make it worse, then, you know, violent crime will continue to rise. Like,
Yeah. But I mean, one of the things I also found, just going back to the blood points piece, I found that was like a really interesting mechanism to incorporate in the sport because it sort of creates an inherent like inequality that in many ways reflects like the inequality that I imagine probably exists within prison systems to an extent already, but definitely exists in the wider society as well, where like when you're just entering the program, you are highly likely to die right away because you've got shit weapons. You're not eating nearly as well as the people who have lots of blood points.
One guy goes in with a spoon. His first weapon is a spoon. And it's like, it's because it's a joke, right? It's just to get viewership. Anyways, continue.
No, you're like, I think that's a really good example. It's like, you've got these people who are like essentially all-star athletes. They're rich, you know, like one of my favorite lines in the book is your subjects are waiting convict because the all-stars like, you know, LT and Stax and like Singer, they all have an immense amount of resources behind them and are treated like professional athletes, basically. But people joining don't have that same amount of resources. It's kind of like the same as the inequality within all sports as well. It was like an interesting and poignant commentary on all like capitalist sports. In addition to being about the prison system.
Yeah, it was a very interesting take on sports as well. And I'm, as somebody who has dated a lot of people who are obsessed with sports, I could recognize that, but I'm like, I don't want to make a commentary on that. I'm like, man. I also found, because it's not a short book. It's like almost 400 pages, I think. Let me see. It's like 360 pages long. And a lot of it is also like a commentary on like race relations, because you can't write a prison book without talking about race. But again, I think it does it in such a interesting way. And like all of these characters are so flawed. That's the whole point. And you get different people's perspectives on each other, including some of the super racist white characters.
Yeah, what's the name of the
Gunny Puddles?
Gunny Puddles, yeah. He has some views.
Yeah, he does. Yeah. But I think he was one of the more interesting characters, because he does represent like what a lot of people in that system would think. He was one of the white characters on the same chain as Loretta and Stax, and he was one of the more difficult ones. Here's the thing, he didn't start very many fights. He didn't like go against the rules. He made it clear that he didn't believe in things. And then you get a chapter that is like from his perspective, where he does think like some pretty horrible racist, sexist stuff. But ultimately, he's not the bad guy, right? Like there is no bad guy. Like you think the whole time you think, oh, this guy's going to cause trouble. But then I was worried about him the whole time. But it turned out that you didn't really need to be. And he even shows up in the end for them to kind of like support them for this last battle that ends up happening. Even he's not the worst, really.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, he definitely like has some egregious views, but he wasn't written as a villain. He was written in like a very, I think, like honest to like there is an archetype of people out there kind of perspective. And like the author clearly spent some time trying to think about like what authentically his views would be, rather than just trying to write him as like he's meant to be this one-dimensional like Trumper, basically.
Yeah. No, he was a very interesting three-dimensional. There was a whole section of the book that was very short, but you just got chapter after chapter after chapter after chapter that were from the perspectives of all of the different members of Loretta and Stax's chain, which I thought was really interesting. You kind of get to see inside their brains a little bit. And it just, I don't know, it just makes the story so well-rounded, like, because they're all so well-written. He's so good at writing characters. I'm so excited for his next story.
Yeah, I've got a question for you. Do you think that this book could be made into a movie?
Yeah, I think it could. I don't think it could. You know what? I don't think it's so good. I don't think it should be a movie, though. I think it should be like a primetime TV show. Like, I think Amazon Prime or Apple TV or HBO could pick it up and turn it into something pretty good.
See, I don't know. I go back and forth on this. I think it would make a fantastic movie or limited series. Either format, I think, would be highly watchable, very popular. But I think it touches too many nerves for any of the major companies today to pick it up.
Maybe you're right. Like, it might be a little bit too on the nose for our social movement. Like, it's very much got its finger on the pulse of, especially in America, which is like, I mean, if a show like this was made, that's who it would be marketed to. And, you know, speaking as a Canadian, our penal system isn't perfect, but I don't think we're as close to making gladiator sports a thing. I don't know. Yeah, I think you're right. I think it would make a very compelling watch. But yeah, you're probably right that like it might be too controversial. I don't know.
I'd like to live in a world where it could be made into a movie, but or a limited series or, you know, whatever. But I like even Handmaid's Tale, which like is shockingly poignant, but it became surprisingly poignant after it already became very famous. And it also has the benefit of like being in this like dystopian world where like current interests aren't really affected. So you can make the show without like hurting anyone's bottom lines, really, because it's like the social forces she's critiquing, I mean, they weren't intended to be real at all. They were like kind of loosely based on Christian fundamentalism. But like today, the real power is like the extreme right in the States, which like is gaining power, but it's not like, you know, the people at like Apple and Amazon are not controlled by like Christian nationalists as directly as like probably a lot of the same forces that run like ESPN and own major news conglomerates have like some financial stake in the critique that's being made here.
Yeah, and I think I would also like to live in a world where this is made. I think because it's told so much from the Black perspective as well, it would be extremely valuable. And we never see stories that are written like this in a way that, I don't know, like, it's so based on the real world. Like there's footnotes throughout the book that are just like, I think I have an example actually that I bookmarked 2 pages, and one of them is there's a section where Loretta had signed on to a hunger strike to protest against ICE, and she's in prison, so it's just like, oh, prison solidarity, right? There's a footnote underneath the letter that they wrote that says about 14,700 complaints alleging sexual and physical abuse were lodged against Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, between 2010 and 2016. Thousands and thousands. ICE was created in 2003 as part of the government's response to September 11th attacks. And that's real statistics, right? And it's horrific. And it's just included as a footnote as part of the story. This whole section was only included because Loretta signed, she ends up being incentivized for signing this petition. So she gets punished with this horrific weapon that scientist created. And then she's like, I can't bear to feel that weapon again. So she signs up for the blood sports the next day to get away from it, which is the same story for our isolation guy. He was also but what happened to him was he got incentivized a lot. She only got it once. He got it for hours and hours, for days. And then he signed up for it too. So just to get away.
But he kind of cracked first. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's only so much a human can take, right? And it was described very well. I believed it.
The interplay between so you get how the characters are marketed, and then you also you're hearing their voices. So you're getting their sort of fully fleshed out personalities at the same time as you're very aware of how they're marketed. And I just thought it was a really interesting approach to making this sort of point that we often treat people as though they're just the worst thing that they've done in the prison system. And that's how Bloodsport portrays it, because it's more palatable. It makes it easier for us to live in a society with prisons that do horrible things to people, whether or not Bloodsport exists. Under the status quo, we do the exact same thing with prisoners today, right? We treat them really as no identity other than their crime. And that even in the most egregious cases, if you can tell a story where you're really focused mostly on only people who have done really horrible things, and you can still sort of think they're complicated and redeemable people, then that, I think, really poses a question of whether the system is just, whether or not you have blood sports. You could think about that in today's context. Our entire system is premised on reducing people to this one identity. That's the only way we justify it.
Yeah, no, this whole story is basically about the concept of redemption and whether it's possible. And I don't think the author gives us a clear answer on that, except by writing characters that are extremely compelling and likable. And it leaves you a little bit speechless. It's so good.
Yeah, there's a lot to think about in this book. And, if this was a book that had come out 10 or 20 years ago, I would have imagined it would be assigned in every high school English class.
I think it might actually still get that. I was reading a bunch of reviews, and people are pretty big reviewers are this is a classic. This is going to be assigned, if not high school, then in university courses. It's so good that I'm kind of excited that I went and got a first edition hardcover. It says first edition in the sleeve. I'm this is actually something that might be valuable one day, and that I'm going to be proud to own.
Yeah, it's really fantastic. I think it deserves to be assigned. I just think it's too much, there's too much censorship in schools now for it to be assigned. So it's not a commentary on the quality. It's a commentary on how fucked I think society is, that I don't think it will be, because too many parents will push back.
I mean, it is a really dark book, and it is extremely violent. I didn't get assigned anything even close to this in high school. I mean, it would be a really interesting read for high school students, certainly. I think that they're old. I think grade 12 students, at least, are old enough to kind of start to grasp the concepts and sit with those. I think it'd be very interesting to see what a bunch of 17-year-olds think about this in a classroom setting.
Yeah, and failing that, it's going to be in a bunch of first-year English lit courses at university. I think you're right about that.
Yeah, I think it's for sure a university book. I think a lot of university teachers. I mean, this just came out. It came out less than a year ago. I think it came out in like October or November 2023. Thanks for suggesting it. This is one of the best books that we've read for the show. Certainly the best fiction book that we've read.
Yeah, I think that's right. Sorry, Ishmael, but this book was incredible, though. It's one of the best fiction books I've read in a long time. It might be my favorite, actually, the more I think about it. Like, I don't know, it was well crafted. The story was interesting. It made a lot of really interesting points. Slaughterhouse-Five is beautiful, but I think this beats it, honestly.
I can't remember having, like, because not only is it a book that has really important and interesting points that are really well delivered, but it's also just a blast to read. Like, it was just so much fun. Like, I didn't have a problem reading it. I read like 100 pages in one sitting, and then I read like 300 pages in another sitting. And it's like, this is a page turner, you know? And not that Slaughterhouse-Five isn't, but it's also like way shorter. It's like 100 and some odd pages. This is like 400 pages.
Yeah, it's true. And like I think the characters and the plot are more interesting. Slaughterhouse-Five is like, it's not really supposed to be about, there's barely a plot. It's a meditation on how evil war is. That is what that book is. Yeah. And it's beautiful. The prose is lovely, but.
Yeah, and I think the best book because if somebody had asked me like, oh, not my favorite book, I think my favorite book is going to be some like childish nonsense, whatever. I like easy books that are fun. But the best written books that I've ever read, I think if anybody had asked me, I would have said Catch-22 or Wuthering Heights. I think they're both so well written and like gorgeous. And Catch-22 had me laughing out loud like the whole time, which is very unusual for me when I'm reading a book. So those are kind of what I was comparing it to when I was reading along. I was like, do I think this is better than Catch-22 and Wuthering Heights? And I was like, I think it is, actually. I think it's way better than Wuthering Heights, at least for character and story. Although the prose, I don't know, it's hard to beat that old-timey stuff when they had to do stiff, shit by hand.
Yeah, that was what I was going to say. The only thing, like, Slaughterhouse-Five and one of my other top novels is The Overstory by Richard Power.
Oh, I haven't read that one.
Oh, we should do it for the show. It's about like activists who end up like doing radical things for tree protection and how they get to that. It's a really interesting book, and the prose is beautiful. So I think those two beat out this book on like just having florid prose that is lovely. But like when it comes to like, I mean, you couldn't do that with this book. It wouldn't make sense. Like, it just wouldn't fit the theme.
Not only that, but like the prose in this book is excellent. Like, it's very well written.
It is. It's not poetic, but it is beautiful.
Well, thanks for listening, everyone. I hope that we have enticed you to read this book if you haven't already. If you have read it already, let us know your thoughts. You can send us a message on Patreon, or I don't know, you can email us at pullbackpod@gmail.com. I believe that's our email address. That sounds right. Okay, bye.